Okay. Upon the receipt of your last, I advised with Dr. Astley and the other doctor, and showed the great authority you cite, but they are not satisfied with Aquinas. This is John Hobart giving his opinion on what is now known as the pseudo-Aquinas commentary on Boethius' Consolation of Philosophy in a letter to his friend Nicholas Bacon on the 18th of November, 1664. Here's Hobart again, previously on the 7th of October, 1664, giving another opinion. In 494, I left my book, which hath it Aristeus, and followed the other, which hath it Arinthius, where the commentator, very dry one, assures me that Arinthius is interfastos. Hobart and Bacon are two friends seen here in the middle of a long-winded debate. From at least the 27th of July, 1664 to the 25th of April, 1665, the pair exchanged letters containing draft translations of three late Latin texts: Boethius' Consolation of Philosophy, a moral philosophical prosmetrum dating from 524, Claudian's satirical invective against Eutropius around 395 to 404, and finally Claudian's panegyric on the fourth consulship of the Emperor Honorius of 398. Their correspondence is preserved in Bodleian MS Tanner 306/2. In their exchanges, the pair give an extremely valuable insight into the process of translation, and in this case, collaborative translation. They discuss matters of grammar, syntax, phrasing, and various other problems as they iteratively refine their translations and suggest improved readings to one another. In the course of their discussions, they name or refer to a number of commentators on both authors, and indeed the commentators reappear at many of the most hotly contested moments in which Bacon and Hobart search for the correct way to construe an awkward passage or interpret a cryptic reference. In the past decade or so, the humanist commentary has received renewed attention in critical circles, and Karl and Enkel and Henk Nellen have suggested that, quote, the commentary was a central, if not the predominant type of early modern paratext. They also suggest that the commentary attempted to construct a bridge that would lead the reader from comprehension, cognitio, to application or practice, usus. I'd like to take these 2 points as key premises for my paper today. The notion that commentary is vital to the transmission of classical texts in the early modern period, and that the ultimate aim of commentary is to inspire practical action rather than passive reading. The idea that commentary is authoritative is, I think, implicit in these suggestions, and this assumption stands behind an Enkel and Nellen's claim elsewhere that, quote, it was assumed that the readers craved precise guidance, and also behind Hobart's description of Pseudo-Aquinas as the great authority you cite. Yet Hobart reveals a difficulty with this assumption. Authority can be challenged. Sometimes, as in the Claudian example I just quoted, an authority is challenged because of the ready availability of a more convincing one. Sometimes, as in the Boethius example, the authority or even authorities, plural, can be disregarded on the basis of nothing more than blind faith and self-assurance on the part of the person using the commentary. So the question which I intend to address today is, in simple terms, this: how did early modern writers actually use the commentaries written by sage humanist commentators active on the continent from the early flourishing of humanism in the 15th century until the period we might term sort of late or post-humanism in the 1650s and 1660s? There are probably as many possible answers to this question as there are translators in the period, but today I intend simply to present two case studies of authors who depart substantially from the straightforward model of reading a commentary and treating it as a reliable source of exegetical information. A number of other questions follow from my opening examples and from the question I've just set out. Why do translators reject the opinions of commentators? And if they're going to reject them, why use them at all? What do these uses of commentaries tell us about the nature and the function of authority? There are also questions of critical posture rather than historical fact. If our somewhat egotistical translators are going to challenge the commentators on their own terms by contesting readings and textual cruces, or by claiming to know the author better simply by intuition, how should we as critics properly conceive of the boundaries between the roles of commentator, editor, and translator? Finally, if in an Enkel and Nellen's terms, commentators themselves, quote, followed their own views against dominant opinion, such that commentaries turned into a playground for intellectual competition between commentators, then what of the competition between commentator and the reader or translator using their work? How serious is the play? And how should we view the tension between the iterative, collaborative impulse in commentaries which have been combined and amalgamated over centuries, and the opposite impulse towards correctiveness and competition? In my paper today, I would like to suggest some possible ways of answering these questions. I will argue that the commentary is an inherently pluralistic form by the mid-17th century, and that users of commentaries enjoy substantial freedom of choice from amongst the work of several centuries of scholarly annotators. I will also argue that in this context, the notion of authority itself dissolves. The idea that a single figure can explain a text and essentially solve the problem of a textual crux is replaced by a conception of authority as something which invites scrutiny and perhaps even contradiction. I'll return to Hobart and Bacon in the second part of my paper, but the first of the translators whose practice I'll consider today is an unknown T.R. They're active in the latter decades of the 16th century, and in 1584, they dedicated a translation of Boethius' Consolation to Margaret Clifford, the Countess of Cumberland, which is now preserved in Yorkshire Archaeological Society's manuscript DD 121, 1812. TR remains an unknown quantity for now, but more can be said of Clifford. Richard Spence argues that Clifford was a committed Stoic and Puritan who spent, quote, much time reading the scriptures, and who associated with numerous Puritan church figures in Yorkshire. In this context, it's unsurprising that, as we will see, TR's translation is coloured by a very strong will towards interpretatio Christiana. This arises in the text of the translation itself, and also in marginal notes, which themselves approach the density and thoroughness of an independent commentary on certain occasions. I'm particularly interested in TR and in their polemical annotations, because they are using, and we might say misusing, an existing commentary. They're looking, I'm convinced, at the commentary by Johannes Murmellius, which includes excerpts of a commentary started but never finished by Rudolf Agricola. The commentary was available either in a single text edition of the Consolation from Cologne 1535, or in a later opera of Boethius at Basel 1570. Yet TR contradicts the commentary almost entirely in spirit and in letter. My identification of TR's use rests on the end matter squeezed onto the final page of the translation. The translator asserts Boethius's stature by reference to the learned writings dedicated to him. His gravity, learning, and life is by writing highly commended to posterity by all these authors. The list of authorities he goes on to name in the bottom right there is an exact transcription of the authors who write or are quoted in the prefatory materials to the text with Murmellius' commentary in the order in which they appear in both 1535 and 1570 editions. Here they are, apologies for the wall of text. The authors cited predominantly fellow humanist scholars and editors. Murmellius, as well as being author of the commentary, writes the dedication of the edition to Rodolfo Langio, and Johann Caesarius had written a commentary on Boethius's 10 predicamentis or categories from De Trinitate in his Dialectices, printed at least as early as the edition of Freiburg 1540, and subsequent reprints. Nicholas Cressius is editor of a previous edition of the Consolation from Florence, 1507. And Jacobus Bononiensis is noted as Praelectio in Boetium Severinum. Baptista Mantuanus features next, the poet and Carmelite who, in the apology to his Parthenice Prima Sive Mariana from 1488, called Boethius most excellent searcher and discoverer of truth. Each of TR's other authorities follow in their turn: Politianus, Platina, Volturanus, Palmerius, Sabellicus, and the Gothic king Theodoric. The edition also features a list of Boethius's extant works, which likewise is copied into the end matter of TR's translation as well. These materials appear in both 1535 and 1570 editions, but not the prior printings of Murmellius' commentary from Deventer 1514 and Cologne 1516. So TR must have been looking at one of the two later ones. It's impossible to say which. The 1535 edition would have been nearly 50 years old, but was a cheap and portable octavo. The 1570 folio, in contrast, runs to 1,500 pages in length and would clearly only have been within the reach of institutional or elite purchasers. In either case, while clearly working with access to an edition of Murmellius, TR takes a substantially different interpretive stance to that of their Latin predecessor. Matthew Royce and Lady Norta have made several observations about Murmellius' commentary, which give me something of a sort of shorthand way to characterize its contents here. They note that Murmellius is, quote, much more interested in the language than in the philosophy of the Consolatio, and that consequently his notes and clarifications focus mainly on grammar, syntax, figures of speech, meaning of words, spelling, other linguistic phenomena, and formal aspects of argumentation. They note the unequal share of attention evident in the commentary, arguing that the first three books receive a greater volume of commentary and explanation than the final two, because Murmellius, quote, had a limited interest in such philosophical issues as the metaphysical status of evil and the reconciliation of divine providence and freedom of the will. Murmellius' text, they argue, is characterized by an apparent absence of desire to read more behind the text than is in fact there, such that mythological passages are dealt with in a cursory way and are not treated as integmenta, that is, coverings of more profound Christian meanings. Ultimately, Joris and Norta argue that the absence of any interpretatio Christiana demonstrates that Murmellius and Agricola viewed medieval allegorization and Christianization rather as impediments standing in the way of a proper understanding of the Consolatio. In each case, as I suggested, the opposite is true of TR. Their interest is overwhelmingly more focused on philosophy and theology than on language. Their attention to the two halves of the work is also unequal, but the other way around, with much greater emphasis on books 4 and 5 than on 1 to 3, so the half of the work which has much more theological gravitas to it. They're much more interested in questions of theodicy and free will than almost any other aspect of the work. Passages such as the Orpheus and Circe myth episodes are construed precisely as fables, which could be just as easily, or perhaps even better, explained with scripture. The Murmellius commentary does feature just a handful of scriptural citations in the 1570 edition, presumably added by the editor of that volume because they're absent from 1535, but these are not citations which TR reuses. As I say, there are only 2 of them. Murmellius also makes repeated use of Augustine. His citations of his works inevitably occur alongside other examples from pagan authors. The only direct acknowledgement of any theological imperative comes in Murmellius' Protestatio at the end of the work. In this commentary that we set forth, by the grace of God, we're about to publish, we approve nothing at all except so much as is decreed and maintained by the Roman Church, etc. This is clearly a conventional formula and does not genuinely reflect most of the material found in the commentary. Murmellius' acknowledgement of theological imperative is merely defensive and conventional compared to TR on Boethius in his dedication quotation to Clifford. The books consist of 3 sciences, to say poetry, philosophy, and divinity, of which these 2 last have some affinity one with the other, but the first is a mere stranger, or rather a contrary to both. And yet, by the excellency of the author, they are in one work or volume, assembled without interruption, mingled without computation, and interlaced without entangling. TR attempts to help synthesize these 3 sciences, as I said, in the text of the translation and in the annotations. They repeatedly cite scriptural equivalents for pagan mythological narratives, and they censor Boethius's inquiries into matters beyond the reach of man. Time prevents me from showing the many dozens of occasions on which TR does this, but here are a few favourites. In 3 Prose 12, TR takes exception to Boethius's use of the pagan story of the Titanomachia to illustrate the theme of a mutinous challenge to authority, and laments that Boethius did not choose a more appropriate example. You can just about make out in the top left margin there. If he had not observed the decorum of philosophy in all this work, he would, as a divine, in this place, have repeated the story of the Tower of Babel. Spence notes that Clifford read only in English and that her daughter, Lady Anne, was forbidden from learning languages as a child by the Earl of Cumberland. It's therefore an attractive coincidence that TR should reach for this particular story whilst thinking about the work of translation, and whilst addressing a dedicatee whose familial, literary, and philosophical interests are scholarly, but firmly monoglot. The note is wholly TR's. Murmellius explains the Titanomachia with reference to Macrobius' Saturnalia, but says nothing of the Babel story. In the following meter, 3 meter 12, TR takes the Orpheus myth as a warning against earthly desires and as an inspiration to seek satisfaction elsewhere. Just as with the Babel reference, they preface the insistent pagan mythological imagery of the poem by drawing a parallel with the biblical woman of Samaria described in John 4, seemingly in an attempt to counteract the poem's godlessness. This is the water Christ spake of to the woman of Samaria, who thirsteth after good shall be satisfied, but the thirst after earthly things is unquenchable. As if to bookend the myth at beginning and conclusion, TR includes a more cryptic reference next to the final stanza, Nemo mittens manum adoratum, etc., which silently refers to Luke 9:62 in the Authorized version, and Jesus said unto him, no man, having put his hand to the plough and looking back, is fit for the kingdom of God. Both of these references too are TR's own invention. The latter also confirms that TR is writing specifically for a patron he knows will understand a partial reference and will be able to complete it for themselves. Clearly then, TR is alive to the same possibilities that an Enkel and Nellen see in commentaries for establishing group identity. A commentary's capacity for strengthening esprit de corps among its readers, they say, is closely connected to its use as a polemical tool. TR's comments often veer towards the polemical, as I've suggested, and the prescriptive too. In their insistence that the Platonism of Book 4, and particularly sort of towards the end, 4 meter 6, should be read as Platonic Christian synthesis, TR cites 2 useful authorities in Ficino and Paulus Orosius. With both authors, TR can allow the Platonism of the surrounding text to stand, while simultaneously claiming learned theological authority for its compliance with Christian teaching. The reference to Ficino is one of the very rare citations which TR does take from Murmellius' commentary. One of only 2, I think the other being one to Augustine on evil as a privation from good, which obviously is conventional. The Italian Neoplatonist is useful authority for TR because, as Thomas Robinson notes, Platonic conceptions of the one are, quote, happily equated by Ficino with the supreme transcendent principle of Plotinus and with the God of Judeo-Christian belief. Ficino therefore provides a model for the kind of criticism TR seeks to undertake in their commentary, namely the convincing synthesis of Platonic metaphysics with a fundamentally Christian worldview. This example might seem to undermine my initial argument, but I've included it because it seems to me to confirm that TR continues to skim through Murmellius as they translate. While what they find is rarely of any help, this seems to be a moment where they can efficiently take a reference from the commentary which agrees with their own worldview and reuse it. Yet even when very occasionally working from Murmellius, TR doubles the weight of their scholia by adducing independently a second authority in Orosius. Orosius saith that God in the beginning of time made the world, in the midst redeemed the world, and at the last shall judge the world. In principio creavit, etc. As a contemporary and student of Augustine, Orosius lends TR a voice possessed of both piety and antiquity. The references to his Liber Apologeticus contra Pelagium de Arbitri Libertate of about 415. The detail only very partially addresses the text of the argument which it's actually attached to, but it works in similar fashion to the Ficino by taking Platonic conceits and highlighting their equivalence with the identity of the Christian God. Just to be certain that the reader understands the point, TR adds more independently authored annotations which suit their own biases. TR takes each of the names given to the Platonic deity in the meter, which is totally neutrally Platonic, not Christian at all, and states plainly that they are synonyms for God. God is called here a high thunderer, God is here called love, God is here called concord, God is here called temper, God is here named the high creator, etc. And they're equally unequivocal in 3 Prose 9 as well, just before. Philosophy discusses the comparable substance of which sufficientia, potentia, clautudo, reverentia, and jucunditas are composed, but TR jumps ahead of the argument which is to come in the main text and assures us straightforwardly, God he meaneth. We can therefore see that TR is much more bothered about matters of devotion than Murmellius can genuinely claim to be. So why does TR use a commentary only to contradict its precepts and avoid directly naming it in relation to actual interpretation. Again, without firmer ground on the identity of the translator, we're limited to speculation, but I would like to suggest several possibilities. First, of course, it is possible that TR also consults another commentary which better aligns with their own taste, though the absence of any reference at all would be odd, given the translator's very overt use of material which clearly does originate with Murmellius. Second, we might say that TR simply wants to establish the prestige of his author in order to assert that he is worth Clifford's time in reading. It would not necessarily matter what previous commentators had thought of Boethius. If TR simply wants to show that an author who's generated so much scholarly output through the Renaissance must be worth the devotee's time. And Blair has suggested similar activities in some commentaries and interpretations on medieval text. The point specific to TR is, I would suggest, that here is a figure invoking a helpful shortcut guide, even though they strongly disagree with the prevailing arguments of the volume. But I think there's also a point to be made about intellectual independence and the assertion of identity. With the multiplication and therefore the democratization of commentary practice over the early modern period, it becomes increasingly legitimate to deviate from the received wisdom of intellectual predecessors and to assert one's own reading. Where TR quotes directly from Murmellius, they're doing little to add their own name to the record of figures whose work has informed interpretation on Boethius over the centuries. Where they deviate, they're doing something altogether new. They're placing themselves in the role of commentator and producing a text in which the new voice supersedes that of its predecessors. And the line between translator and commentator seems to blur here. And Enkel and Snellen again argue that a contrarian commentator could undermine their author by using the commentary, quote, to belittle, reject, and even behead the original author. For example, by explicating his work in a deliberately false and tangentious manner. In this way, the commentator delivered a counter-commentary, or rather a counter-text. Just as the constant provision of biblical parallels underscores the pagan origins of Boethius's myth fables, the strength of the translator's polemic against Boethius in some other instances highlights the reality that arguments which are central to the text are morally unacceptable to a devout audience, even though TR is translating this for Clifford. TR eventually comments on what is absent from the text rather than what is present in it. They therefore write something approaching a counter-commentary on the text, but they also hypothesize a version of the text in negative, in which the Tower of Babel or the women of Samaria really might be part of the narrative Boethius is telling. This perhaps is where the translator as commentator differs from the pure commentator, while the commentator like Murmellius always remains a figure separated from the text in both abstract intellectual terms and physical manifestation in mise en page. The interpreter like TR moves in a space which seems to drift between the intellectual rigor of humanist commentary and the creative emulatio of loose translation, almost at will. TR can very fairly be called a commentator, but they can also claim protection in their more outlandish moments in the commentary from the fact that the name of translator legitimizes a degree of creative remaking, which commentary itself cannot easily facilitate. To return to a line I quoted earlier, though, if the margins of TR's translation are a playground for intellectual competition, the play is clearly serious when it concerns questions of devotion. It is serious both because the subject matters and because TR's mode of insistent contrarianism owes something to the mindset of a critic desperate to establish their own credentials, even if, in doing so, they actually engage in bad criticism. It's an easier proposition to deconstruct something with a wholesale corrective reading than it is to exhibit judicious skepticism and a qualified sympathy with earlier efforts. TR's approach stands in contrast with that demonstrated by Hobart and Bacon, and for the remainder of my time, I'd like to return to their discussions of Boethius and Claudian and to think about their very different manner of handling commentaries. Like TR, they elect to challenge the wisdom laid out for them by humanist commentaries, but they do so in a more pluralistic and intellectually generous way. In this section of my paper, I'll suggest, in essence, that theirs is a project which consciously eschews objective certainty over original text, correct translation, and the authority of specific individuals, and privileges instead a model of deliberate irresolution. Multiple source texts, the voices of multiple commentators and learned editors, and the voices of innumerable other authors each compete for attention. Much of the pair's characteristic style arises from conventions of epistolary culture, a culture which places great emphasis on a transactional rhetoric of debt and exchange, and which demands that every letter sent generates another in reply to ensure continuity of friendship and discussion. But their use of commentaries picks up this model and implicates the commentators themselves in this endless process, which deliberately avoids settling questions or textual problems too definitively. Many treatments of the period's tradition in commentary and similar practices turn on phrases like the organisation of knowledge and seem to invoke an epistemology of neat and orderly arrangement. I'm thinking here about works like Anne Blair's Too Much to Know, Managing Scholarly Information, and Angus Vine, Miscellaneous Order, Manuscript Culture, and the Early Modern Organisation of Knowledge. I'd like to suggest that the opposite obtains in Bacon and Hobart. For them, rather than offering precise guidance, the glut of commentary material available by 1664 is, in my model, a tool which enables endless circular debate and ponderous discussion, one which resists sort of neat organisation. So what do Hobart and Bacon have on their desks? while they draft and refine their translations. Between them, they have at their disposal at least 4 editions of the Consolation and 3 editions of Claudian. Bacon names 3 commentators on Boethius. I mentioned Pseudo-Aquinas at the beginning of my discussion. The example at the top here is Hobart, but Bacon actually has the copy and refers to it multiple times. In the letter of the 21st of November, Bacon consults an edition by Petrus Boethius in an effort to resolve an uncertainty around fortune laughing at wretched men in 2 meter 1. For Boethius's bold criticism, I see no reason for it. For Boethius complains of fortune for laughing at her own cruelties, and Boethius makes him say they are worthy to be laughed at, which is contradictory. In the same letter, Bacon also cites the commentary by Renatus Valenus, printed in 2 editions in Leyden, 1656 and then 1671. He consults Valenus to resolve another crux at the end of 2 meter 1, which follows and depends on the passage on fortune's laughter. Valenus soberly corrects it, suique magnum monstrat ostentum, etc., he says. Bacon therefore has at least 3 substantial commentaries available to him, possibly 4. In a discussion of another passage on the 29th of September, Bacon notes that all my 4 copies have habitans, not hebitans, but the identity of the 4th copy and hence its commentary material can't be determined. Similarly, Hobart has at least 3 Claudians. He writes to Bacon in April 1665, "'Tis true, sir, that Ephyra and Ephyre signify Corinth, but that is not in Sparta, nor hath either of my books Ephyre with an I. But there is Ephyros, a Laconian town, which the author may intend, and if the ablative be Ephyra or Ephyre, then it will stand well, with excutiat cineres in 476. Thus, the Spartan Ephyra's ashes may off shake." The 2 books presumably include his original copy and the edition that Bacon had sent him as a gift the previous November. "Sir, since my last to you, I received the last and largest Claudian, which I sent for with an intention to present it to you, if it proved worth your acceptance, that so you might have better authority to rest upon than my conjectures, and have some assistance in your other translation. And this I did also as a kindness to myself, for I confess it troubled me that the best interpreter of Claudian should not have the best edition of him." Before he received the gift from Bacon, Hobart had also borrowed a copy from a friend. As to that of 386, if it be a mistake, it was, I confess, of election, for I left the text in my own book, and so far as I remember it, that which I borrowed of Sir Philip, and followed the comment I before commended, not for any reason by him given, but for some manuscripts he cited, and because it seemed to me, when offered, to carry a better sense. This is Sir Philip Woodhouse, by the way, who is some 20 years Hobart and Bacon's senior at Emmanuel College in Cambridge. Hobart nowhere gives the details sufficient to enable concrete identification of his editions, but several editions of Claudian's opera had been published through the middle decades of the 1600s, including those with substantial commentaries by Caspar Bartius at Frankfurt 1650 and Nicholas Heinsius, Leyden 1650. Bartius advertises, as you can see, the efforts he's taken in consulting 17 manuscripts on the title page of his edition. So it's possible that Hobart's "some manuscripts he cited" refers to this version. A variorum edition, combining Heinsius's commentary with selections from several other commentators, later appeared in Amsterdam with an imprint date of 1665. If this edition was printed at the end of 1664 and post-dated for the new year, it's possible that Bacon's insistence on the superiority of the absolute latest edition could be made with reference to this text. So what do Hobart and Bacon do with their edition? Well, as we've seen, they use them at least in part as a way of resolving textual cruces in the source text. As they compare readings from different editions, they're essentially taking on the role of collating editors. But we soon get the sense that this process does little to confirm or foreclose any given reading in a definitive manner. Bacon and Hobart are not afraid to issue value judgments on their editions. Bacon's line I quoted some time back seems to imply a textual emendation in the Boethius, which he was talking about, which Bacon feels is doubtful. Certainly, Hobart's mistake of election in declining 2 editions and approving a 3rd implies a discriminating value judgment. Critically, in the latter case, we see Hobart acting by intuition and self-assurance. Enkel and Nelland suggest that many humanist commentators were, quote, happy to follow their philological intuition rather than following collation of textual witnesses, and that a skilled editor or commentator considered it feasible to project himself into the personality of the author, into his idiom and literary tradition, to such an extent that he could heal textual decay by means of guesses. We might think here of the tradition of conjecture in this period as something which has a lot to do with spontaneous inspiration, we might say almost a sort of poetic inspiration. In these kinds of moments, we begin to see the lure of supposed authority decay into contradiction. If we accept that humanist commentaries in the period are motivated, at least in part, by a will to preserve old and by implication authoritative knowledge against the threat of loss, then any divergent or contested use which invokes and rejects the knowledge transmitted in a commentary rejects this value system. Equally contradictory is the juxtaposition of poring over multiple old editions and commentaries and an evident faith in the teleological drive towards ever-improved text in new editions. I mentioned Bacon's gift, sent with the note which equates the last Claudian with better authority and which it implies it is the best edition. The same mindset arises in a warning which Bacon sends Hobart in relation to the Against Utopias translation on 26th of October. Your justification of Labarus by the election of it in some manuscripts may very well pass, but whenever you decline the last edition, it will put put you to the trouble of rendering a reason for it to all your readers. In Bacon's mind, then, even readers of a vernacular translation will be able to sense when a translator has based their work on an old text rather than a new one, and will take them to task for doing so. Clearly, this is a kind of translation which is intended to be read by individuals who are in fact experts in Latin philology themselves, rather than by readers whose only access to classical texts is in vernacular renderings. As we've seen, Bacon and Hobart have access to plenty of editions and plenty of commentaries, and yet they still pick and choose their readings according to principles of selection which change and which seem to contradict each other. In the final part of my talk, I'd like to turn to perhaps the most characteristic feature of their discussion, which again arises directly from the dilatory and digressive conventions of epistolary communication. On several occasions, Bacon and Hobart use their commentators, and indeed their own intuition against the commentators, to engage in what is essentially academic ping-pong over a period of several weeks. The first of these concerns a passage of Against Eutropius, and the second a passage from the Consolation. Bacon is first to raise the crux in Against Eutropius in a letter of the 29th of September. My copy, instead of Flos Syria Savet, reads Flos Syriae Servet, which, if you admit, the sense will run thus. For Scythian woods they change Argean grounds, beyond Cimmerian fens the Taurus bounds. The flower of Syria serves, nor can the prey the fiery foe drive, that doth the refuse slay. On 4th of October, Hobart replies and acknowledges his error with part of the passage, which is attributed to errant copy text. I verily think, sir, that your aim in this was by a favourable insinuation to win me into sight of my omission of Terrorum Claustra. I confess I did not take notice of it, for my book hath neither comma at Cimmerius nor Claustra. I have now mended my copy with your distic for Scythian woods, etc. Hobart nevertheless expresses characteristic tenacity with his reading of the crux. And this is the third excerpt there. I must loath to part with Servet, for if I mistake not, Claudian's intent is to show the universal contempt upon Eutropius, which emboldened not only the Dacians' hosts, but the provinces and subjects of the Roman Empire, the Syrians, etc., etc. Hobart's explanation relies on his usual combination of contextual validity of language and his own sense of the history being described in the poem. Bacon is not convinced and replies on the 10th of October. Your reasons against service I conceive are not conclusive, for though the Syrians did sometimes rebel, yet I cannot find they did so in Arcadius' reign. And since your copy hath mistaken Terrorum Claustra, it is probable it hath mistaken this also. Bacon raises a critical problem with the collation of variants from multiple source text. Once an edition is doubted in one place, a translator is inclined to doubt it in other places too. Hobart's interests as a humanist and antiquarian mean that he's never short of further sources to consult in defense of his readings, and his final answer once more implies that recourse to external materials offers a legitimate means to continue debate and avoid final determination. There my book is Flos Syriae Servet Spolis next sufficit. I confess your sense as by your book is very handsome, yet for the reasons I humbly offered to you before, and for that Cappadocia seems to be the common seat of war and place of plunder, it is more probable to me that the Syrians did take the opportunity of Eutropius' contempt to rise to spoil, than that the Geats did overrun Syria, and I am a little confirmed in this opinion upon sight of the maps. If Hobart cannot answer with philology, he'll do so with cartography instead. I'll return to this point shortly. The other protracted debate, the one in the Consolation, concerns a line from Book 4, and like the Flos Syriae Servet crux, it occupies the translators for an entire fortnight. It also reveals much about the translator's methods, which is not apparent in the Claudian example. Bacon first queries the line when he responds to some previous corrections from Hobart. Your corrections also of my poems are very commendable. Only in two things you differ from Aquinas' comment, for thus he, mens inquam existens, miles cursi sideres, id est Dei, quies splendidum sidus. The debate concerns the proper reference of miles, and the term occurs in a passage of convoluted syntax. Most interesting from a historical standpoint is Bacon's reference to Aquinas, as he calls him. He quotes the line from the commentary now known as the Pseudo-Thomas text, as I said earlier, and sometimes attributed to William of Wheatley. Despite the age of the commentary, Bacon implies that it remains worth consulting, and seems to be surprised that Hobart would deviate from his readings. Shortly after, Hobart explains his reasons on the 18th of November. Sir, you will not marvel to see me varying from any commentator who never did see any upon Boethius, but 10 years ago at Sir Thomas Cotton's upon the 9th metre of the 3rd book. But in this of Miles Cursi Sideris, I took the opportunity of Dr. Porter asked his opinion of it, who presently said that Coruscurus Sidus must signify Mars, and Numine I filled that blank as he received it. Upon the receipt of your last, I advised with Dr. Astley and the other doctor, and showed him the great authority you cite, as I said at the beginning, but they're not satisfied with Aquinas. The reason common to us all is for that it was with Boethius, his continued regular climax, to mount the soul to heaven before she arrived to the text starry, and where it might be objected that Mars by that rule ought to have preceded Saturn, it is answered that Miles is spoken as presuming she'd been in Mars' sphere in the way to Saturn, and it's some satisfaction your Aquinas interprets Miles for the soul. convoluted, but essentially Hobart's describing what really matters here is that he's describing a widening of the translation process from two individuals in discussion to a discussion amongst a larger group. It's easy to imagine this scene in which Hobart embodies what Gary Schneider has termed the sociotext epistolary model, as the letter is either read aloud or passed from one reader to the next. The closed epistolary dialogue motivates a wider discussion in a wholly separate context. The anecdote likewise accords with the intellectual honesty of Hobart and Bacon's own stance. Herbert Astley and Edmund Porter were both prebends of Norwich in 1664, and might well have been more sympathetic with an approach to the consolation, more in the vein of TR's Interpretatio Christiana, but their response is predicated on philological grounds regardless. Perhaps most importantly, the convocation of learned interpreters seem to know by instinct what Boethius really meant. Here we get back to that notion of conjecture, and they aren't afraid to refute a commentator who had once been considered authoritative, but which Joris and Notenort eventually was ridiculed by the humanist. Importantly though, Astley and Porter's rejection of Pseudo-Aquinas is predicated not on the latter's change in reputation, but by their collective original thoughts in the argument that we've seen secondhand in the letter. Bacon continues the exchange on 21st of November. Now, sir, familiaris corsi sideris, I conceive it may be understood of the Sun, Jupiter, or Saturn, as well as Mars. Of the Sun, because the soul was last mentioned to be there, of Jupiter, because she really was last there, and of Saturn, because she was there at that time, especially if her accompanying any star makes her the Miles of that star. But because I cannot see any great reason for this, I think Aquinas' opinion is best, which doth not mount the soul to heaven by calling her Miles, for she must be militant before she is triumphant. On the 25th, Hobart refutes his friend's elegant tricolon. Miles corsi, etc., seems not applicable to the Sun nor Saturn, they having had their share. It signify any star Miles inclines it to Mars. If it be then objected that Jupiter is left out, so are the other three subsolarian planets. The energy of the debate ultimately dissipates without any definitive justification for one reading over any other, as the translators continue to exchange substantial volumes of notes and corrections about other passages at the same time, not just this one. Bacon concludes on the 28th at the bottom there, "Sir, I did not so much as think of correcting my copy till we had agreed the sense of Miles corsi sideris, but now you seem to be indifferent, I've corrected it thus," and he gives his version. Bacon's characterization of Hobart as indifferent crystallizes the essential character of the writer's partnership. The process of construing meaning can be extended nearly indefinitely, but it's an intellectual game rather than a genuine pursuit of absolute correctness. In one sense, Hobart and Bacon are engaged in academic one-upmanship, though it always remains good-natured. In another, their exchange of refutations, which are at once game-like dilations and productive debates, accords well with the view of humanist seria ludere, in which play need not be an activity of little consequence. So Bacon and Hobart effectively practice the parts of criticism. They resolve the text, correct it, and deliver it. What do they do with this hefty dose of skepticism towards existing commentaries and their corresponding faith in their own better abilities? Ultimately, they begin to mine sources to compile what is essentially their own comment. In the discussion of a passage from Claudian's Fourth Consulship, Bacon adduces natural histories, mythographies, travel writings, and numismatics to clarify a reference to an ancient musical instrument. Pierius, in his hieroglyphics, out of Plutarch, makes the sistrum an emblem of vicissitude. Erat, saith he, sistri species, etc. The appearance of the sistrum was circular and likewise hollow, in whose circumference 4 fickle bells were suspended. Lilius Giraldus saith thus, sed denem Isis, sed creditor, etc. Certainly Isis was believed a deity in Egypt, who with the sistrum, shaped carrying the right hand, signified the approach of the Nile, with the urn, which was held in the left hand, symbolized the flowing of all the waters. And thus you may see Isis described in the title page of Sand's Travels, he goes on, with the sistrum in her hand like a racket, as Anthony Agostini, the Italian antiquary, compares it upon the like figure in Adrian's coin, and certainly 'tis liker a timbrel than a trumpet, but properly neither one nor the other. Bacon's first reference is to Barzani's Hieroglyphica, which appeared in at least 15 editions to 1631. Bacon then quotes from Giraldi's description of Isis in his De Deis Gentium. George Sandys' A Relation of a Journey, begun Anno Domini 1610, which was published in 1615, indeed shows the figure of Isis holding a sistrum on the title page. It was retitled Sandys Travails in the 6th edition of 1658, so presumably this is the one that the pair are talking about. So Bacon seems to have had access to both old and new works of natural and cultural history, which would suggest a current interest, either wholly his own or shared with an acquaintance whose books he could borrow. Bacon affords natural history the same evaluative potential as philology. Geographer and grammarian are of equal use to his project, which is at once literary and cultural. Bacon also cites an authority who conflates these activities in precisely the way he does himself, and who thus provides a methodological precedent. Bacon refers on several occasions to Stephanus' Ethnica, available in 16th century printed Greek epismes, which are an encyclopedic volume in scope, despite the fragmentary nature of the original text. Robert Browning notes that Stephanus was neither geographer nor historian in the true sense, but rather was a grammarian whose prime interest is the correct formation of ethnic adjectives, for which he has 2 criteria, morphological regularity and regional usage. Bacon indeed uses his Stephanus for this kind of information regarding names and descriptions. In the same letter where he uses the Hieroglyphica and Sandys Travails, he notes that both Ortelius and Stephanus say that Liguria is now called Riviera de Genoa. Elsewhere, he reminds Hobart that the Oriental Dacians were probably called Gates, so Stephanus in his historical dictionary out of Strabo. So ultimately, translated text makes up a very small percentage of the exchanges between Hobart and Bacon. Their interest in the kinds of matters I've been discussing, philology, history, antiquarianism, is much more sustained. And indeed, the poems themselves emerge from this hierarchy in a rather ossified state. Each draft is written and becomes instantly obsolete because the translator's critical stance is so insistently defined by notions of improvement and sequential perfecting. Viewed in retrospect, Bacon and Hobart struggle to emerge as poets or artful translators in a manner consistent with modern aesthetic sensibilities, and are much more like the commentators whose work of annotation could substantially outmatch the text itself in scope and ambition. So why do they invoke so many commentaries only to reject them? The answer, I think, is partly similar to the one I gave in relation to TR. The greater the number of commentaries invoked, the weaker the claim any one can make to definitive authority. The more contradictory texts Bacon and Hobart can adduce, the freer they become to write their own pseudo-commentary instead. But there are important differences too. TR can justify their inventive and literally unprecedented commentary because they stay so much more firmly on the creative translation side of the literary spectrum than the learned commentary side. And the commentary they do write becomes part of the creatively remade text. Bacon and Hobart cannot claim this protection, but with the commentary-like discussion itself becoming the primary object of their work, which is both creative and scholarly, the original texts become adjuncts to the commentary rather than the other way around. Interestingly, this suggests to me that the earlier late humanism is not so different from the origins of humanism in the 15th century as we might expect. Texts such as Niccolo Perotti's Cornucopia have been read in a similar way, as in that they become the text and the original text becomes the adjunct, despite coming 200 years before Bacon and Hobart. Most notably, using multiple commentaries instead of only one, Bacon and Hobart maintain a studiously cultivated, if somewhat wry and cynical, respect for the iterative and collaborative history of scholarly interpretation, even while they frequently prefer the competitive mode of asserting their own better judgment. Private letters are, of course, a fundamentally different medium to that of a printed commentary or a dedication sent to a recipient in a presentation manuscript. But there are enough clues in Hobart and Bacon's letters. Their discussion with Astley and Porter, a compelling moment elsewhere in which Bacon suggests Hobart should commit the letters to the flames if they reflect badly on their author, for me to say with reasonable confidence that the authors probably wanted their piecemeal commentary preserved for posterity as a testament to their erudition. If, as I think we might, we find more interest in their deliberations about previous commentators than in those individual commentators themselves, then they have surely been vindicated.